She opened the door, eyes wide with surprise. "I can't believe you're here," she whispered. I just smiled and said, "You invited me, long before tonight, with your eyes." It was a quiet evening in the building, the kind where even the hum of the elevator sounded softer, more deliberate. Rain traced delicate lines against the hallway windows, tapping a steady rhythm that echoed faintly off the pale walls. I had just returned from a long day, keys in one hand, a grocery bag in the other, when I noticed her door open. She stepped out, almost colliding with me. A brief flash of surprise crossed her face, her eyes widening, breath catching for a fraction of a second. She wasn't the kind of neighbor you just ignored in passing. There was a quiet poise about her, the sort of presence that made the air feel a little heavier, a little more aware. I can't believe you're here," she said softly, almost like the words escaped before she meant them to. I paused, unsure whether to laugh or ask what she meant. The hallway light framed her hair, dark with subtle streaks of silver that caught the glow, and for a moment neither of us moved. There was a stillness, not awkward, but charged, as if something unsaid had already passed between us long before this meeting. "I live here," I finally replied with a small smile, shifting the bag in my hand. "And I think, in some way, you've been inviting me, even if only with your eyes." Her lips parted slightly, a faint laugh escaping, quiet, restrained, but genuine. She looked down for a moment, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. That single movement, so simple, carried a weight I couldn't quite name. The scent of rain drifted between us, mingling with the subtle trace of her perfume, warm, like cedar and something faintly floral. She shifted the book in her hand, the sleeve of her cardigan slipping slightly, revealing the soft curve of her wrist. For a moment, I wondered what her evenings were usually like. Did she often step out hoping someone might pause long enough to share a few words? Or was this one of those rare nights when loneliness cracked her well-composed exterior? "I was just heading down to the mailbox," she said, voice steady now, though her fingers lingered on the doorframe behind her. "You surprised me, that's all." "Good surprise or bad surprise?" I asked gently. She met my gaze again, really met it this time, and there was a quiet warmth there, something unspoken yet undeniably present. "Let's just say, unexpected," she murmured. The rain pressed against the windows again, a soft shiver of sound. Neither of us made a move to leave right away. Our footsteps, usually passing in polite silence, felt rooted for a moment. "Maybe next time," I said finally. "You'll expect me." She gave a faint nod, a small smile tugging at her lips, the kind of smile that doesn't end at the mouth but flickers briefly in the eyes. And as I turned toward my door, I felt her gaze follow, not intrusive, just lingering, like a question left hanging gently in the air. The rain had cleared by the next evening, leaving the city washed and cool. From my balcony, the air smelled faintly of wet concrete and jasmine from a neighbor's potted plant below. I was leaning against the railing, mug of coffee in hand, when I noticed her again, 2 balconies over, 1 floor down. She was standing alone, elbows resting lightly on the rail, her face turned toward the distant skyline where the last hues of twilight still lingered. Her hair was loosely tied back this time, a few strands falling free as the evening breeze stirred them. I hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but not wanting to let the quiet pass between us as it always had before. Something about last night had shifted the space between our doors. "Beautiful evening," I called softly, not loud enough to startle, just enough for the words to carry. She turned, a slight look of surprise crossing her features, then softened when she recognized me. "It is," she said after a moment, her voice low, almost lost in the hum of the city below. There was a pause, not empty, but expectant. She didn't invite me over, not with words. But the way her hand rested near the edge of her railing, fingers slightly curled, and the way her gaze held mine for just a second too long, it felt like an opening. I found myself moving, almost unconsciously, down the short flight of stairs to her level. She didn't step back. She didn't look away. "Tea?" she asked simply, as though the question had been waiting for its chance. The faintest smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. I'd like that. Inside, her apartment was warm, lived in without clutter. The soft glow of a single lamp in the corner, a stack of books on the side table, a faint hint of sandalwood in the air. She moved with quiet confidence, setting the kettle on without rushing, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. I don't usually have company, she said, not looking at me, but her voice carried a note that felt like confession more than statement. Neither do I replied, leaning lightly against the kitchen doorway. Maybe we're both breaking habits tonight. She glanced over her shoulder, a small, almost imperceptible nod acknowledging the truth in that. When the tea was ready, she handed me a cup, fingers brushing against mine for the briefest second. Warm porcelain met cold fingertips, and for that heartbeat of contact, the room felt narrower, more intimate. We stepped back out onto the balcony, each with a steaming mug, the city spread like a canvas of quiet lights. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't the awkward kind, it was the kind that lets two people listen to the same night, and somehow feel closer for it. As she leaned against the railing again, a faint breeze stirred her hair against my arm. She didn't move it. Neither did I. And in that moment, between the distant hum of traffic and the soft clink of ceramic against the railing, I realized, sometimes, the most meaningful invitations aren't spoken at all. It was a few nights later when I found myself standing outside her door again. This time, she had been the one to ask. A quiet message slipped under my door earlier in the day. If you're free tonight, stop by. I'm making tea. I knocked gently, and her voice, warm, low, invited me in. The living room felt like a world of its own. Amber lamplight pooled in soft corners, a faint jazz melody playing low from a small speaker on the shelf. The scent of something citrusy lingered in the air, mixed with the faint sharpness of freshly brewed tea. She was on the couch, one leg tucked beneath her, a loose sweater draped over her shoulders. A book lay open beside her, its spine soft from many reads. You came, she said, not quite a question, more like a quiet recognition. You invited me, I replied with a small smile, hanging my coat on the chair back. There was a stillness that didn't demand to be broken. I sat opposite her at first, but the room felt too large for that distance, so she motioned for me to take the seat closer, just a cushion between us. She handed me a mug. Our fingers touched for the briefest second, her skin warm against mine, a pulse of quiet awareness passing through the simple act. We talked, not about anything monumental at first. Work. Neighbors. How the rain seemed to come and go without warning this season. But slowly, her voice shifted, carrying something more personal. I've always liked this hour, she said, looking toward the rain-speckled window. It's quiet enough to hear yourself think, but not so quiet it feels empty. There was something in her tone, a faint crease of loneliness hiding between the words. You live alone? I asked gently. She nodded. For a while now. It's easier that way. She let out a soft laugh, the kind that comes from habit more than amusement. Easier doesn't always mean better, though. I sipped the tea, letting the warmth spread through my palms. I think easier can sometimes feel safe. But safe can feel empty too. She turned her head toward me, her eyes catching the lamplight, the faintest trace of a smile curling at her lips, not from joy, but from the comfort of being understood. For a moment neither of us spoke. The jazz filled the silence, soft and slow. Her hand shifted on the couch between us, resting near my knee, not touching, but close enough that the space felt deliberate. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. I don't usually talk like this, she admitted, voice quieter now. Not with neighbors. Not with anyone, really. Maybe it's not about who, I said, watching her fingers trace the edge of her mug. But when the right moment finally arrives. Her laugh this time was gentler, real. And in that room, with the rain pressing softly against the glass and the faint hum of the city outside, I realized we were no longer two neighbors sharing tea. We were two people daring, in quiet ways, to be seen. The rain had returned, a quiet, steady drizzle that made the night feel softer, more secretive. I found myself at her door again, this time carrying a small box of pastries from the corner bakery. I had told myself I was only dropping them off, a simple gesture to thank her for the tea and company the other night. But I knew, even as I climbed the stairs, that it wasn't just about pastries. She opened the door before I could knock twice. Her expression shifted, surprise first, then that same warm, reserved smile she always seemed to wear when her guard was halfway down. "You really didn't have to," she said, taking the box from my hands. "I know," I replied, shrugging lightly. "I wanted to." The apartment was dimly lit, the lamp from before casting its amber glow across the room. The jazz was gone tonight, replaced by the sound of rain against the balcony door. I didn't step all the way in. Neither of us did anything in haste. We stood near the doorway, the air between us carrying a weight that had nothing to do with words. She set the box down on the side table and turned to me, her fingers brushing a loose strand of hair back behind her ear, a small, familiar gesture by now. "Do you ever wonder," she asked suddenly, "why some people cross paths, and it feels like they were meant to?" Her voice was soft, but the question hung in the space like a thread stretched taut. "Sometimes," I said. "Sometimes it feels like the moment you notice them, you've already been walking toward them." Her eyes met mine, not a fleeting glance this time, but a held one. Long enough for the sound of the rain to feel louder. I shifted slightly, meaning to leave, to give her the space to close the night where it was safe, but her hand reached out, just briefly, resting against my arm. It wasn't a grip. It wasn't even a hold. Just a touch, fingers grazing the fabric of my sleeve, the faint warmth of her skin seeping through. "You don't always rush away," she said quietly. "No," I murmured. "Not when I don't want to." For a heartbeat, either of us moved. Her thumb traced a small, unconscious arc against my arm, the kind of motion you don't plan, the kind that says more than words dare. Then, almost as if catching herself, she withdrew her hand, clearing her throat lightly. "It's late," she said. "You should get some rest." I nodded, though the weight of that brief touch lingered, warm against the cool air of the corridor as I stepped out. And when the door closed softly behind me, the rain followed me down the hall, a steady whisper, carrying with it the memory of her fingers and the question in her eyes that neither of us had fully asked yet. Morning came with a soft light spilling over the courtyard, the kind of light that makes the edges of things seem less sharp, less hurried. I was halfway down the steps, still shaking off sleep, when I saw her by the row of mailboxes. She was dressed simply, a loose blouse, hair still damp from a shower, no makeup, just the easy grace of someone caught between routine and daybreak. She was flipping through her letters when she noticed me. "Early for you," she said, her voice carrying that gentle surprise I'd come to recognize. "Could say the same for you," I replied, lifting the small bundle of envelopes in my hand. She smiled faintly, then looked back down, sliding a bill into her bag. "I like this hour. Fewer people. Fewer eyes." There was something in that, a quiet truth, maybe even a trace of vulnerability. I didn't press. Instead, I lingered a little closer than usual, enough for the faint scent of her shampoo, citrus and something floral, to brush the air between us. We stepped toward the stairs at the same time, our paths aligning naturally. She moved a strand of hair from her face, the gesture casual yet somehow deliberate, and I noticed the way her blouse shifted, revealing a glimpse of the warmth beneath the layers she usually wore so carefully. "Long day ahead?" I asked, more to keep her voice close than to fill the silence. "Meetings, mostly," she said with a soft sigh. "Nothing worth waking up early for, really. Except..." She paused, almost imperceptibly, then let the sentence trail off with a faint smile. At the bottom step, a cool breeze swept in from the open courtyard doors. She turned slightly toward me, her fingers reaching up, almost without thought, to straighten the collar of my shirt. It was such a simple gesture, but her touch lingered a heartbeat longer than it needed to. Her fingertips grazed the edge of my neck, warm and light, and I felt a quiet stir beneath the calm morning air. "There," she murmured, drawing her hand back. "Now you look like you belong to the day." I laughed softly, not at her words but at the way they felt, like something more than neighborly, but not quite spoken. She glanced at her watch, then toward the street where a car horn sounded in the distance. Coffee? She asked suddenly, then caught herself. Another morning, maybe. We'll both be late. Another morning, I echoed. As we parted ways, I caught her looking back once, not for long, just enough for our eyes to meet before the crowd of the waking city pulled her into its rhythm. And as I walked toward the corner cafe, collar still carrying the warmth of her fingertips, I realized how easy it was becoming, these small collisions that stitched our days together without either of us naming them yet. The building went dark just after dusk. One moment the hallways hummed with their usual faint glow, the next a sudden hush, the kind that only comes when electricity cuts out and every appliance surrenders at once. I was about to light a candle in my apartment when there was a soft knock on my door. "It's me," her voice said, low but steady. When I opened it, the corridor was dim, only the moonlight slipping through the narrow window at the far end. She stood there with a small box of matches and a faintly amused expression. "Power's gone," she said. "Figured we might as well share the darkness." I followed her to her apartment, where a few candles already flickered across the kitchen counter, casting warm pools of light against the walls. The space felt smaller tonight, not in a way that crowded, but in a way that gathered everything closer. She set a kettle on the stove out of habit, then laughed at herself when nothing happened. "Old reflexes," she murmured, shaking her head lightly. We settled at the table, each of us leaning slightly forward, the candles between us painting our faces in amber. For a while we spoke of nothing, the storm outside, the unreliable grid, a neighbor downstairs who probably wouldn't notice a blackout even if it lasted all week. But then her tone shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. "I used to love nights like this," she said, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "When I was younger, it felt like the world paused just for a moment. Now it just feels loud." "Loud?" I echoed. She nodded, eyes fixed on the candle flame. "When everything else stops, the noise, the screens, the distractions, it's harder to ignore what's left." There was a softness to her words, but also a weight. She rarely spoke like that, not about herself. I didn't push. I just listened, the way one listens when the silence between sentences feels as important as the sentences themselves. "I've built a life that looks fine from the outside," she went on quietly. "Work, friends, independence. But some nights, it's just me and the walls." The room felt warmer suddenly, not from the candles, but from the closeness her honesty brought. I shifted my chair slightly, just enough that my knee brushed hers under the table. Not hard, not forward, just a quiet acknowledgement that I was there, that I had heard her. She didn't move her leg away. Instead, after a moment, she let out a soft breath and leaned a fraction closer, her shoulder nearly touching mine. When her head finally came to rest against my shoulder, it was without ceremony, as though it had always been an option she kept tucked away for a safer time. Her hair smelled faintly of rain. The candlelight flickered across the curve of her cheek. And in that fragile stillness, I realized, the walls she spoke of weren't made of brick or paint. They were made of pauses, of hesitations, of nights like this, and for the first time, one of them had quietly opened. Twilight was folding over the city when I found myself on the balcony again. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain-soaked streets below, the hum of distant traffic rising and falling like a tide. It had been a few days since that candlelit evening, enough time for the memory to settle, but not fade. Her balcony light flicked on just as the first stars started to appear. She stepped out slowly, a light shawl over her shoulders, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. For a moment, she didn't notice me watching. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the last streak of pink was dissolving into the night. When her eyes finally found mine, there was no surprise this time, only recognition, and something softer beneath it. "Out here again," she said, her voice a calm note against the evening air. "Habit," I replied, leaning on the railing. "Some habits are worth keeping." She smiled faintly, and for the first time, it reached her eyes without hesitation. After a moment, she tilted her head toward the stairs between us, a silent question. I took it. The short walk felt different tonight. There was no nervous rush in my step, no second-guessing in the way her fingers tightened slightly around her cup as I approached. When I reached her balcony, she set the tea aside and folded her arms against the rail. "It's strange," she murmured, "how some people feel like they've been around much longer than they have." "Strange in a bad way?" I asked quietly. She shook her head, her hair shifting gently with the movement. "Strange in a way that makes the world feel less empty." The words hung there between us, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I stepped a little closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough that the warmth of her shawl brushed my sleeve. Her hands rested lightly on the railing, and before I could think better of it, mine settled just beside hers. Our fingers didn't tangle, not yet, but they found the same edge of space. She looked up, her eyes searching mine, not for permission, but for truth. And whatever she saw there, it made her exhale softly, a breath that carried a quiet surrender. Her hands lifted, slowly, deliberately, until her palms framed my face. They were warm, steady, a touch that didn't ask, only offered. For a moment, we just stood there, foreheads leaning together, the city lights flickering beneath us. "Is this what you wanted?" she whispered. "No," I said gently. "This is what I waited for." She let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh, the kind that breaks something open without breaking it apart. When her thumbs brushed lightly across my cheeks, it wasn't a promise of something more. It was the answer to all the pauses, all the hesitations, all the nights spent standing a few steps apart. A quiet yes. Not loud. Not rushed. Just real.